My name is Victor. I'm 46 years old. I know what you're probably thinking when you see my calm face, that I'm a man who doesn't know how to defend himself, someone who lowers his head when the storm hits. But let me tell you something I learned the hard way. Silence is not weakness. It's the time you need to sharpen the knife. While my mother-in-law was screaming that I was a burden, a failure who didn't even deserve the air her daughter breathed, I wasn't hurt. I was counting. Counting every word, every insult, and every dollar I planned to take back from them. You're useless. You can't give my daughter a luxurious life. She deserves a real man, not a mediocre one like you. Those were the words that echoed through the dinner celebrating our 10th wedding anniversary. She shouted it in front of everyone, wearing that cruel smile of someone who believes she's superior. My wife, Emily, said nothing. She just stared at her glass of wine, letting her mother's poison fill the room. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't married to just one woman. I was married to a parasite and her accomplice. They believed I was the ground beneath their feet, but they forgot that the ground is the only thing holding the entire structure up. If I moved, they would fall. And that's when I decided I was going to move. If you like stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, leave a like and subscribe. Here, we share real stories of revenge and lessons that are never forgotten. For years, I was the invisible architect of their comfort. My life was reduced to a routine of discipline and sacrifice that few men my age would be willing to endure. I woke up at 5 every morning, before the sun even brushed the windows of our house, and worked until my eyes could take no more. All that effort had a single purpose: to build a castle for Emily. She didn't work, she never did. She claimed her job was to take care of the home, but the truth was that the home was maintained by 3 housekeepers I paid for with the sweat of my brow. Emily dedicated herself to shopping, lunches with friends, and above all, listening to the constant poison of her mother, Margaret. Margaret is the kind of woman who measures a person's worth by the brand of watch on their wrist. From the very first day I stepped into her family, I was the enemy. To her, I wasn't the man who loved her daughter. I was the employee who wasn't meeting production expectations. I come from humble beginnings. Everything I have, I built from scratch. No inheritance, no favors. I started as a simple analyst and eventually founded my own logistics consulting firm. But to Margaret, my success wasn't merit, it was an obligation. At every Christmas dinner or birthday, she would remind everyone of the millionaire suitors Emily had supposedly turned down to stay with me. She looked me up and down, judging my shoes, my car, the tone of my voice. For a long time, I chose the path of stoicism. I thought that if I provided everything, if nothing was missing from that table, respect would come naturally. Rookie mistake. In the world of empty people, generosity is mistaken for submission. Emily became so accustomed to abundance that she stopped seeing it. The jewelry I gave her ended up at the bottom of a drawer within days. Trips to Europe turned into complaints because the hotel wasn't exclusive enough or the weather wasn't perfect. And there I was, paying the bills, signing the checks, maintaining a professional smile, while inside I felt myself slowly fading. My relationship with Emily turned into a business transaction where I was the sole provider and she was the dissatisfied client. There was no intimacy anymore, only demands. I need this. Mom says we should change the SUV. Margaret says your office looks small. My mother-in-law's name echoed through every corner of my marriage. She was a constant presence, a shadow that darkened any attempt at real connection. Margaret practically lived with us, even though she had her own apartment, paid for by me, of course. She walked through my house as if she owned it, criticizing the menu, the decor, and above all, my ability to generate money. I believed balance existed because I was holding it up with my shoulders. I thought that as long as the accounts were in order and the image of a perfect family remained intact, I was winning. But the reality was different. I was financing my own humiliation. I sat in my office, surrounded by contracts and strategies, realizing I was capable of running a company with hundreds of employees, yet at my own table I was treated like a second-class guest. Emotionally, I was completely numb. I no longer felt love. I felt a heavy responsibility, like an anchor dragging me to the bottom of the sea. Emily and her mother had formed a solid block. They were a unit of contempt. I remember one afternoon when I came home early because I wasn't feeling well. I heard them in the kitchen. They didn't know I was there. Margaret said, "You need to pressure him more, Emily. The money is there. He's just a cheapskate who wants to save everything for retirement. I didn't raise a daughter to live on budgets." And Emily, my wife, the woman who vowed to stand by me through good times and bad, replied with a sigh, "I know, Mum. Sometimes I'm embarrassed when my friends see that we still haven't bought the beach property. He says it's not the right time, but I know it's just because he doesn't have enough ambition." That day I stood frozen in the hallway. I didn't feel like screaming or crying. I felt a cold clarity. I understood that I wasn't their family. I was their ATM. They didn't see the man. They saw the resource. And the worst part was that I had taught them to treat me that way. I gave them power over my peace of mind in exchange for the illusion of a home that never truly existed. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror and saw a 46-year-old man at the peak of his career, being trampled by two women who had built nothing in their lives. That was the moment the balance finally broke. The man who accepted scraps of affection died in that hallway. The man who began to observe every move, every expense, and every legal vulnerability was born. All that was missing was the final trigger, the moment when their masks would completely fall in front of everyone. And that moment was coming soon. The bomb finally exploded in my own house on my birthday. I didn't want a party, but Margaret insisted on organizing an intimate gathering that turned into a full display of her arrogance. They invited her friends, people I barely knew, all of them carrying that air of inherited importance. I was sitting at the head of the table, feeling like a stranger in my own dining room. Emily didn't even sit next to me. She was too busy showing off a diamond necklace that, of course, I had paid for, while telling everyone it was a family gift. The atmosphere was heavy. Margaret had already had 3 glasses of wine, and her tongue was loosening with that cruelty she mistakes for honesty. They started talking about a real estate investment that several people there had joined, a luxury opportunity that, according to her, I had missed out on because of fear. In reality, I hadn't avoided it out of fear, but because it was an obvious scam I had analyzed with my lawyers. But for Margaret, that was the final proof of my supposed mediocrity. "Victor just doesn't have that vision of greatness," she said, raising her voice so everyone could hear. Silence fell over the table like a slab of stone. "He prefers what's safe, what's small. My daughter could be living in a real mansion, with white-glove servants, but here we are in this house that's already getting old." I placed my cutlery down on the plate. I made no sound. I stared at her, but she didn't stop. Emily, sitting beside her, simply nodded while adjusting her necklace. There was no defense, no "Mom, stop," just silent complicity. That was when Margaret delivered the sentence that changed everything. "You're useless, Victor. You can't give my daughter a luxurious life. The last name is too big for you, and so is the woman. If it were up to you, she'd be living in a middle-class apartment. You're a coward hiding behind spreadsheets while my daughter wastes her youth waiting for you to become a successful man." I felt my blood turn cold. The guests lowered their eyes, uncomfortable, but no one said a word. The humiliation was public, deliberate, and complete. I looked at Emily. I expected to see a trace of shame in her eyes, but all I saw was annoyance. She was embarrassed by me, not by her mother. "Mum is right about one thing, Victor," Emily said flatly, almost bored. "You should have taken that risk. Sometimes I feel like you settle for so little that you drag me down with you." That was the final betrayal. It wasn't physical infidelity. It was something much deeper, the total invalidation of my existence and my effort. In that moment, while Margaret laughed and asked for more wine, I made a decision. I wasn't going to shout, I wasn't going to throw glasses or tell them to leave. I simply stood up, poured myself some water, and said with a calm that even sent a chill down my own spine, "You're right, Margaret. Maybe I'm not the man you need." That same night, after the guests left, I heard them laughing in the living room as I went upstairs. They mocked my silence. They thought my lack of response was surrender, that they had broken my spirit. "Tomorrow he'll apologize with a trip to New York," Emily told her mother. "You'll see. He always does when he feels guilty for being so boring." But there would be no trip. The next morning, while they slept in late, I was already in my office with a team of accountants and lawyers who were not part of the firm Emily knew. For years I had kept everything under marital ownership, but they didn't know that I had been moving my most important assets into protected trusts long before the situation became unbearable. The real blow came 3 days later. Emily returned from an afternoon of shopping with Margaret and found all her suitcases outside the house. Not in the hallway, on the sidewalk. The locks had been changed. When she tried to use her credit card to pay the taxi that brought them back, it was declined. She tried the other one. Declined again. I walked out the front door, closing it behind me. I stood on the porch, watching them. Margaret immediately started screaming, her face red with fury. "What is this nonsense, Victor? Open this door right now. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Emily stood there, pale, staring at her suitcases, as if she couldn't believe her glass world was shattering. "The house isn't in my name, Emily," I said calmly, "and it's not in yours either. It belongs to a corporation that just sold it. You have exactly 10 minutes to collect whatever is on that sidewalk and leave before private security removes you for trespassing." Margaret lunged at me, trying to slap me, but I stepped aside effortlessly. Her hatred was pathetic. Emily was crying, but not out of love, out of fear. "Where am I supposed to go? You can't do this to me. I'm your wife," she screamed. "You were my wife while I was your ATM," I replied. "But since I'm a useless man who can't give you luxury, I've decided to free you from the burden of living with me. You're now free to find that successful man your mother wants so badly. I hope his wallet is as big as his patience, because mine ran out last night." That was my symbolic expulsion from their world of parasites. I left them there, screaming on the street, surrounded by suitcases full of expensive clothes they would no longer have anywhere to wear. I felt no remorse. I felt the purest air I had breathed in decades, but this was only the beginning. They thought losing the house was the worst part. They had no idea what calculated justice truly meant. Emily and Margaret's mistake was believing that my intelligence was limited to numbers on a screen. They didn't understand that a man who builds an empire from nothing knows exactly how to dismantle any structure, brick by brick. In the weeks that followed, I settled into a place they didn't know about and turned off my personal phone. I let desperation do its work. I knew Margaret would try to attack me legally right away. She always believed she was smarter than her bank accounts allowed. I met with my lawyer, a man named Harrison, a shark in both corporate and family law. I wasn't looking for a friendly settlement. I wanted a controlled demolition. "Victor," Harrison said as he reviewed the documents, "you have 90% of your assets protected, but they're going to come after the company." I smiled. That was exactly my plan. I had left a trail of crumbs, an appearance of vulnerability in one of my subsidiaries, so that their greed would make them bite the hook. Margaret, using the little savings she had left and selling her jewelry, hired a high-profile attorney, one of those guys who charges per hour what a working man earns in a month. She thought that by suing me for abandonment and demanding an astronomical alimony, she would regain control. What she didn't know was that I had already documented every single expense they had made over the last 5 years. I had recordings from the home security cameras, which they had forgotten existed, where Margaret could be heard planning how to drain my accounts and Emily laughing about my supposed ignorance. In the legal world, intent to commit fraud and conspiracy to dissipate marital assets are powerful weapons if you know how to use them. My revenge wasn't impulsive. It was a choreography of patience. While they spent money they didn't have on lawyers, I focused on rebuilding my peace. I went back to the gym, regained the weight I had lost to stress, and started sleeping 8 hours a night. Every time Harrison called to tell me that Emily was crying during preliminary hearings, I felt a cold satisfaction. It wasn't joy. It was confirmation that order was being restored. Through my investigators, I discovered that Emily was already seeking comfort with an old boyfriend, one of those men with an important last name but empty pockets that Margaret so admired. I let them continue. In fact, I made it easy for them to meet in public places. I wanted her to feel safe, to believe life was giving her a second chance, while I was supposedly going under in the legal process. But the reality was that I was suffocating their options. I bought the debt on the apartment where Margaret was living. She didn't know it, but the bank had granted her a bridge loan based on the expectation of my money. I pulled the necessary strings through third parties and became the creditor of her own home. Now, every time she turned on a light or opened a faucet, she owed money to me. It was a quiet pleasure, an irony I savored every morning with my coffee. The final strategic detail was the education and healthcare trust I had created for Emily years earlier. She thought she could liquidate it and walk away with the cash. What she didn't read in the fine print was that the fund was only executable if we remained married and if there was no evidence of wrongdoing on her part. When I presented proof of her complicity with her mother to defraud me, the trust was automatically frozen. They lost their emergency parachute. I remember one afternoon when I ran into Margaret by chance at a shopping mall. She looked at me with pure hatred, but this time she didn't scream. She stepped closer and whispered, "You're going to end up on the street, Victor. Emily will take everything, and I'll make sure no one in this city ever gives you work again." I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I simply adjusted the knot of my tie, looked her straight in the eyes and said, "Mrs. Margaret, the problem with people who live off appearances is that they forget appearances don't pay the bills. Have a good day." That calm drove them insane. They were expecting a broken man, a man who would beg for forgiveness or explode in rage. But I was a ghost who was buying every single debt they accumulated in their attempt to maintain a lifestyle that no longer existed. My rebuilding plan wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. I was cleaning my life of parasites while making sure they learned the true value of what they had despised. The trap was set, the paperwork was signed, and the day of final judgment was approaching. It would be the most expensive performance of their lives, and I had a front row seat. On the day of the final hearing, there was no shouting, at least not from me. The courtroom was silent, carrying that familiar smell of old paper and formality that precedes final verdicts. Emily arrived dressed in black, trying to project the image of a widow of a marriage she herself had killed. Beside her, Margaret wore her finest coat, chin held high, still believing her arrogance could intimidate the law. They looked at me with contempt, as if my presence were just an annoying formality before receiving their big check. My attorney, Harrison, stood up holding a blue folder. He didn't need emotional speeches. He presented bank statements, the transfers Emily had made to her mother's hidden accounts over the past 2 years, and records of the debts Margaret had taken on using my name as collateral without my authorization. Margaret's face shifted from triumph to an ashen gray in a matter of seconds. The judge, a man with a hard stare, reviewed the documents with a slowness I found strangely satisfying. "Mrs. Emily," the judge said without looking up, "there is evidence here that you attempted to liquidate assets held under an irrevocable business protection trust. Were you aware that this constitutes an attempt at procedural fraud?" Emily stammered. She looked at her mother, searching for the cutting remark that had always saved her, but Margaret was speechless. The trap had closed. Not only would they fail to receive the $1 million alimony they demanded, but due to the clauses in our prenuptial agreement, which they had signed without reading carefully, too busy planning the wedding, any attempt at fraud nullified all compensatory benefits. "My client," Harrison intervened with professional coldness, "is not only requesting the immediate dissolution of the marriage without compensation, but is also filing for the execution of the promissory notes of debt accumulated by Mrs. Margaret, notes which, after a series of financial transactions, now belong to one of my client's companies." At that moment, Margaret stood up, forgetting where she was. "This is a trap. This useless man doesn't have the capacity to do something like this," she screamed, pointing at me with a trembling finger. The judge slammed the gavel with a force that echoed throughout the room. "Ma'am, one more insult and I will have you arrested for contempt of court. Sit down." I remained seated, hands clasped, watching them fall apart. Emily began to cry, but this time the tears were real, the kind that come when you realize the ground beneath your feet has disappeared. She was no longer the proud woman who ignored me at dinners. She was a woman who had just lost her income, her home, and her status. The ruling was merciless. The divorce was granted on her fault. With evidence of misappropriation of marital funds, she wouldn't receive a single cent. But the best part was yet to come. As we left the courtroom, we stopped in the hallway. Margaret approached me, eyes bloodshot, makeup smeared, breath short. "You've left us on the street, you miserable bastard," she hissed. "Do you think this will bring you peace? Do you think you're a man for doing this to your family?" I stepped closer so only she could hear me. Emily stood a step behind, trembling. "I didn't leave you on the street, Margaret. You moved there the day you decided my respect had no value. By the way, the apartment you're living in has an eviction notice that will be delivered in 1 hour. Since I'm now the owner of the debt, I've decided I'm not a patient landlord. And Emily," I looked at my ex-wife, who lowered her gaze, "I hope that diamond necklace is real, because it's the only thing of value you have left. Although, according to my records, I paid for it with company funds as well, so my attorney will be by tomorrow morning to collect it as part of asset restitution." Emily sobbed, covering her neck with her hands. Margaret tried to scream again, but a security officer stepped closer, and for the first time in her life she had to swallow her poison. She turned around and walked down the hallway, dragging her feet, her daughter following like a broken shadow. They were no longer queens of my world. They were just two ordinary people facing the consequences of their own greed. I walked toward the courthouse exit. The sun was shining with an intensity that almost blinded me. I sat in my car, a sober model that didn't need to scream success, and closed the door. The silence inside was absolute. For years, my life had been a constant noise of demands, insults, and expectations. Now, finally, there was nothing, just me and the result of my work. I started the engine and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. There was no need to see what the landscape looked like after the fire. I knew exactly what I had left behind, the ashes of a marriage that never truly existed, and two women who would discover in the bitterest way that the useless man was the only thing keeping them from falling into the abyss. Justice isn't kind, but it is precise, and my balance after so long was finally 0. 6 months have passed since that day in court. Sometimes the silence of my new life is so deep that I can hear my own heartbeat. I didn't look for another woman, nor did I take refuge in expensive vices. I simply focused on watching the world they built on lies finish collapsing. The last time I heard about Emily, she was living in a small, rented apartment on the outskirts of town, working for the first time in her life as a receptionist at a dental clinic. I was told she no longer wears jewelry, and that her eyes have lost that shine of superiority that once defined her. I know even less about Margaret, and that gives me immense peace. I know she tried to sue me 2 more times, but no serious lawyer would take her case without an advance she can no longer afford. Her circle of friends, the people she admired so much, disappeared as soon as the money stopped flowing. In that world of appearances, if you have nothing to offer, you cease to exist. She learned that a sharp tongue is useless when there is no man left to pay the bills her insults create. I often wonder if there was ever a moment when we could have been happy. But then I remember the laughter in the kitchen, the contempt at the dinner table, and Emily's coldness when her mother called me useless. I understand now that some people are not built to love, they are built to consume. I was the fuel for their vanity, and when I stopped burning for them, they were left in the dark. I don't feel joy in their downfall, but I don't feel pity either. What I feel is a technical satisfaction, like an engineer watching a poorly designed structure collapse under its own weight. My life is different now. I keep working, I keep building, but now the foundations are real. There are no more shouts, no endless demands, no shadow judging every step I take. I learned that loyalty cannot be bought, and that respect is a boundary no one should ever cross, not even under the excuse of love or family. Life is a very strict ledger. You can falsify the entries for a while, but at the end of the day, the balance always has to add up. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching life collect its debts. It's letting time place everyone exactly where their actions earned them. They wanted a man who could give them luxury, and I gave them the lesson of their lives, the freedom to go look for it on their own. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, leave a like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, turn on the bell so you don't miss the next stories.